This is lecture 12D, although I forgot to write the D up there. I'm going to talk last time about the Tang Dynasty and how it collapsed in the early 900s. Now I want to talk about the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty succeeded the Tang Dynasty. It was founded by Zhao Kuangyin, who again was a general who sort of staged a military coup and then expanded the kingdom that he had inherited and conquered the rest of China. But the Song Dynasty learned the lessons of the Tang Dynasty in some of the wrong ways. Right? The Song Dynasty, from its beginning, decided that the best way to rule China was to, instead of emphasizing military prowess and giving enormous strength to governors and celebrating governors, the Song Dynasty saw a cultural shift as the dynasty celebrated cultural achievements rather than military achievements. And they did that in a number of ways. One is that they tried to limit the power of local governors and military governors and tried to downplay the military success. But they also elevated bureaucrats and talked about, tried to develop an ethos of serving the state and being civil servants and sort of glorifying that. But they also, there was a real period of flowering of cultural sophistication, that it wasn't enough to be a good warrior now who was crude and gruff. You had to be sophisticated and polished and know about art and good calligraphy and flower arranging and all sorts of other things. And so this cultural shift allowed for Chinese culture to flourish, but it also led to military weakness. And part of this was intentional on the Song Dynasty's part. They simply didn't want to risk a military revolt by their own generals or a coup from within. But this led to weaknesses. In particular, the Song Dynasty never gave its provincial governors, especially on the borderlands with Central Asia, gave them enough power to really deal with the nomadic armies that they had to face out in the steppes of Central Asia. And this culminated in 1127 when a group of nomads called the Jurchen invaded northern China and basically cut off the northern portion of China. The Song Dynasty retreated south then and would last for another 150 years. But then in the early 1200s, the Mongols come out of Central Asia, North Central Asia, and they conquer the Jurchen, and then they very gradually would conquer the Song Dynasty, and the Song Dynasty would finally fall in 1279, and the Mongols would have conquered all of China, which leads to the Yuan Dynasty, which I'll talk about in a later lecture. But the Tang and the Song Dynasties then were a period of enormous cultural and technological and economic flourishing in China. And they really were a sort of a heyday of Chinese culture. There were a number of reasons for this. First of all, economically, China expanded dramatically. And there were a couple of reasons for this. One is that you begin to see in the 900s and especially in the 1100s, you begin to see much more global trade, especially Indian Ocean trade, not global yet, Columbus hasn't happened, but trade around the Indian Ocean by boat. And you really see the expansion of trade, and the volume of trade dramatically increases. And part of this is that China is now producing a whole bunch of things that the rest of the world wants. China had perfected silk cultivation and silk production, silk comes from silkworms. They're actually a kind of a moth, and they spin a cocoon around themselves, and then you take the cocoon and you throw it in hot water, and you can unravel the cocoon, and you get these strands which you can then weave into silk. China closely guarded the secrets for making good silk. In particular, the idea of throwing them into hot water so you can unravel the cocoon rather than cutting it open, which a lot of other cultures had done. And so Chinese silk was considered the best in the world, and everybody wanted Chinese silk. So China begins to develop this huge export market in silk, and I'll talk in a later discussion about how export markets and economic specialization had a huge environmental impact. But for right now, in southern China, huge portions of the economy switch over to producing silk for export because suddenly China has a much bigger market for its silk than it did before. And not suddenly, but it grows over a couple centuries. In addition, Chinese spices like ginger and kinds of peppers and things become very popular spices elsewhere in the world, and as far away as Europe. And so China has this fantastic pottery tradition of making porcelain that the rest of the world loves. And so China becomes a major exporter and a major manufacturing center. And this boosts China's economy dramatically. But there's another innovation that also happens during this time, which really helps China to grow, and that's agricultural innovation. Southern China had always had a rice-based agricultural system, but during the Tang Dynasty, they discover several strains of rice from Vietnam, which are way more productive, and they really work. They develop better techniques with wet paddy rice agriculture, and this leads to dramatic increases in agricultural surpluses. They can produce way more rice than they could before, and this has a profound impact because, first of all, it allows people, because they can produce enough food with fewer fields, they can move other things into growing, like silk cultivation, which requires mulberry trees, which is what silkworms eat. So they can increase silk production because they need less land for food. But it also causes population growth. Between the 900s and the 1100s, China's population doubles. Right? This is a huge growth, and this economic growth fosters international trade, and it makes China a much wealthier country. And so this economic boom is happening over a couple of centuries and is really helping the Chinese economy. But China also was innovating and changing in other ways. One is China has always been, throughout most of human history, China has been a technological innovator and a technological leader. If you were, today you tend to think of Europe and the United States as the Industrial Revolution and all that technological innovation. But before 1500, you would really, if you had to pick a place that had the most technological innovations, it was China. Right? And just to give you some idea of how far ahead China was from the rest of the world, China developed writing on its own. It's one of the three places that developed writing on its own, several thousand years BC. But they developed cast iron in the 4th century BCE. Europe didn't discover casting iron until hundreds of years later, like 800 years later. All right? They invented the blast furnace for smelting iron in the 1st century BCE, right? The 1st century BCE. That's 1,500 years ahead of when Europe discovers the blast furnace, right? They invent paper in the 3rd century, right? Incidentally, they also invent toilet paper, so you can thank them for that. In the 9th century, they discover gunpowder, right? And by the middle of the 10th century, they had invented crude guns. Now, Europeans would take gunpowder, and the Ottomans would take gunpowder and transform it into the cannon and turn it into a major military weapon. And China didn't succeed in doing that, but China invented gunpowder and invented guns. They invented movable type in 1045. Europeans invent printing in 1450s. So this is, 400 years earlier. Now, the Chinese never invented printing the way we would think of printing. They didn't have a printing press where they could print whole pages and print whole sheets of books. Instead, what they had is they had what we would call woodblock stamps of different characters. And so if they wanted to make a copy of a book, they would carve a wood block stamp for each of the characters in the book. So if there's 200,000 characters in a book, they would make 200,000 wood block stamps, and they'd have them on a huge rack, and then if you wanted to print the book, you would take one stamp, and then take the next one, and then take the next one, and you would print the book that way. This is slow, but it's much faster than handwriting out all those characters. Just taking a stamp and going is a lot faster than writing the calligraphy for each character, which has a number of brush strokes. So they invented printing. They invented the lock and dam. On the Grand Canal, they used locks and dam system to handle elevations. So they invented the lock and dam system in the 900s. They invented the compass, or they discovered the compass. They invented the mechanical clock. So really, China was way ahead of the rest of the world technologically through the Tang and Song dynasties, and even earlier in the Han Dynasty, China was technologically advanced, and China would really only lose this technological advantage after the 1500s, when Europe, with the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and then the Industrial Revolution, launches itself on this sort of spurt of technological innovation that would lead to the Industrial Revolution. Last area I want to talk about is religion. The Buddhism was trickling into China almost from the inception, and so there were Buddhists in China, in the first centuries CE. But what's interesting is that as Buddhism came to China, it changed a bit. And the reason was that, of course, all the original Buddhist texts were written in India, and they have to be translated into Chinese for the Chinese to read them. And one of the interesting things is that a lot of the Hindu or Buddhist words, like samsara and moksha, etc., got translated into Chinese using Taoist terms, right? And so, for instance, Dharma, which is in Buddhism, is the sort of eightfold path, this sort of method of training yourself, becomes the Tao, the way, in Chinese, and this inflects Chinese Buddhism. It gives slightly different meaning to the Chinese Buddhism because all these terms already have all these connotations from Taoism, and so the Chinese Buddhism emerges in its own fashion, and it becomes fairly popular. It spreads throughout southern China in particular, and becomes a major force, and it becomes a challenger to Confucianism, although there's only a few moments in China's history, such as under Empress Wu and then later under the Mongols, where Buddhism is actually embraced by the Chinese government. For the most part, it's Confucianism. But Buddhism is spreading throughout the population, and it has important sort of cultural effects. And one of these is actually that during the Song dynasty, you see the emergence of a new form of Confucianism called Neo-Confucianism. And this is happening under the influence of Buddhism. It's that basically Buddhism offers a sort of, like Taoism, offers a personal morality and a sense of how the universe works, and a sense of how to make sense of the universe that Confucianism doesn't. Confucianism is a set of rules about how society should be organized. So Neo-Confucianism is actually this attempt by Confucian scholars to develop a sort of philosophy of the universe, and to develop a personal philosophy to give a larger, almost religious meaning to Confucianism. And they borrow a lot of ideas and a lot of terms from Buddhism to do this. And so Neo-Confucianism, you start to see the development of things like qi, which is this life force, this vitality force, and they start to explain, the flow of qi and things, to explain health and sickness, and to explain why things happen, etc. And it becomes much closer to being a religion, although it's not really yet a religion in any technical sense. So overall, the Tang and Song dynasties are this period of really incredible technological innovation, economic growth and agricultural innovation, and even cultural innovation through new religions and Neo-Confucianism, etc. And so these were really a heyday of Chinese culture. And I just want to mention in passing that I just want to connect this, right? That the Tang dynasty was contemporaneous with the rise. I mean, the Tang dynasty is coming to power in the 600s, and it is contemporaneous with the sort of birth of Islam. And as the Tang dynasty is consolidating in China, you see the Abbasids, the Umayyads solidifying their control of the Muslim empire. And the early Tang dynasty, as I mentioned, they ran into and conflicted with the Abbasids. And the early Tang dynasty is a period after the collapse of the Roman Empire, and you really see this period of the early Middle Ages, which was sort of the Dark Ages in Europe, where European civilization really regresses badly. But the later Tang Dynasty and then into the Song Dynasty is a period where Europe is really rising. Late medieval Europe, high medieval Europe it's called, is really becoming much more prosperous and powerful. And the Song Dynasty also corresponds to the sort of heyday of the Abbasids, right? And I talked about all sort of Abbasid cultural achievements. So there's a real cultural flowering happening, especially under the Song Dynasty compared to the Abbasids, compared to medieval Europe. There's real cultural flowering going on there. And it's interesting to keep this in mind, that these things are happening at the same time across different cultures.